Lessons will be learned. How often do we hear that glib reaction, even today, in response to trauma, gravely inadequate responsibility and care, across the whole range of man's duty to others? Are lessons ever learned? No. In so many cases, no. As such was the case in the terrible event that led to this commemoration today, the universal colliery disaster in Senghenydd on October the 14th, 1913. Arglwydd raglaw, prif weinidog, archesgob Cymru, gwesteion anrhydeddus holl, boneddigion, boneddigesau, anwl gyfeillion, ffrindiau. Lord Lieutenant, First Minister, Archbishop of Wales, honoured guests all, ladies and gentlemen, friends. More than anyone, may I welcome the residents of Senghenydd, the Aber Valley, and everyone who has a connection, in family or in feeling, for your fellow man, with this commemoration today. Wherever you are from, Wales, the United Kingdom, or from overseas, to all of you, a warm welcome. To some of you, welcome home. Welcome home. Croeso unwaith eto i'r cwm, a welcome again to the valley. Gadewch i ni ddechrau wrth fynd yn ôl, lawr y daith dros y blynyddoedd. To set the scene, let's go back along the track, down the years. Idris Davies, the common man's poet from Rhymney, wrote in his poem Gwalia Deserta, "There are countless tons of rock above his head, and gases wait in secret corners for a spark. And his lamp shows dimly in the dust, his leather belt is warm and moist with sweat, and he crouches against the hanging coal, and the pick swings to and fro. Oh, what is man that coal should be so careless of him, and what is coal that so much blood be upon it?" In Ridwan Williams's book Amseri Wylo, Time to Cry, Senghenydd 1913, there is a letter written from one friend to another after a silence of some time. Dyma fi, yn fyw o hyd ar ôl y tywelwch, fi'n gweithio yn Senghenydd, y pwll gorau yn y byd. Here I am after some time of silence, still alive, I am working in Senghenydd, the best pit in the world. The letter was received in North Wales, early on October the 14th, 1913. The explosion had happened an hour before. On that morning, Harry Wedlock had been awake from 4 a.m. in the morning. At 14 years of age, this was his first day at work. In the Universal Colliery, he was due to work with Sidney Gregory of 24 Station Terrace. His mam had prepared his tommy box and jack. His working clothes were on the chair, and he was full of excitement and apprehension. But he was ready for anything. Now here was a day he'd remember. As I look around at the numbers here today, it signifies how deeply what happened here 100 years ago has entered into the psyche and soul of the nation. A record-breaking event that was thrust in a callous calamity upon a community. The largest loss of life of any coal mining disaster in Britain. The third largest in the entire world. We are here to commemorate, to pay tribute, and to give respect and honour for all those who paid the ultimate price in the quest for coal. Disasters, of course, are classified as 5 men or more. Gleision Colliery, 2 years ago, took 4 lives, but it was a reminder of the sacrifice in the coal industry. With that in mind, I wrote a special message with a Welsh translation on one of the paviors on the memorial site to especially honour those who died in unclassified disasters. It reads, "Dedicated to all those who worked in the coal industry in Wales. Men and boys coursed their life's blood to carve the coal-seamed Klondikes into new communities. Vibrant of spirit and searching of soul, they set up from wage contributions the keystones of society in their clubs, institutes, halls, libraries, hospitals and chapels. In the constant quest for coal, some paid the ultimate price. Some in mind-numbing disasters, others on their own, and others in small groups. Gleision Colliery, with its loss of 4 men on September the 15th, 2011, revisited the memories of old. May they be the last fatalities listed on the long, long register of sacrifice. In that today we remember Senghenydd and the disaster at the Universal Colliery of 1913, let us stress that this is a national mining memorial, and I could, and should, mention other disasters. Abercarn, 268 men lost. Albion Kilfynydd, 290 lost. Gresford, 266, Ferndale 178, Cymer 114, Llanerch Abersychan 176, Wattstown 119, Park Slip Tondi 110, Rysca Waenfawr 146 and 120. Those are the ones in the hundreds. If you were to count all disasters of 5 men or more, the figure is over 6,000. If you added the ones below the line of 5 for a disaster figure, to count and include the loss of those in groups of 4, 3, 2, and those who perished on their own, what would the total figure be? If you added those who died slowly of silicosis or pneumoconiosis, or 100% dust as it was called, where the cause of death on the certificate was something else, like pneumonia, so no compensation had to be paid, what would the total figure be? If you added Aberfan in 1966, where 144 died, mostly children in a school, in a coal-tip slide, what would the figure be? But we are here today, in Senghenydd, to pay homage to our forebears, with whom we are related, those of us from the Welsh coalfield. For this tribe, who gathered in the Klondike and melting pot that was the new mining community, became a hugely important patch on the quilt that is Wales. We were all hewn from the black gold and crystal seams that got into the blood and moulded a special breed who fed the powerhouse of the world. Senghenydd is a symbol, and it's a story so common to so many of the coal communities countrywide. We welcome our compatriots from Durham who are with us today. What happened at the Universal Colliery on October the 14th, 1913, was the tragic last step on the pathway leading to disaster. And isn't fate fickle? This valley was once called Park and was the ancient hunting ground for the lord at Caerphilly Castle. The local chieftain, Ifor Bach, gave the Normans real trouble in his day. The few farms on the ridges here gave evidence of the rural scene and setting of the Aber Valley in the past centuries. In the 1880s, the city of Cardiff seriously considered drowning this valley for a water supply reservoir. There was a change of mind. That what-if scenario of fate and history kicked in. 1891 saw the first glint of coal interest, and the Universal Pit was sunk. The sinkers' cottages, all single-story and terraced, were lined to my left as I stand, at the roadside there, where so many of you now stand this morning. The 2 colliery shafts, the Lancaster and York, were there just behind me, with their winding gear. Behind me in the trees and the underground districts were given names familiar to those who read the Boer War reports in the newspapers. Mafeking, Kimberley, Ladysmith, Pretoria, Botanic and West York. The Universal was a dry pit, with dangerous dust everywhere, waiting for a spark. That spark came at 5 a.m. in the morning of May the 24th, 1901, on a Friday. 82 men were down the pit at the time, and only one survived. Ostler William Harris, saved by his horse that was killed at his side. The explosion in 1901 was greater than the one that followed in 1913, but it was between shifts, so only 82 men were underground. Another hour or so, and 900 would have been there. There was an inquiry, of course. Professor W. Galloway of Cardiff University, on conclusion, made many recommendations. The main 3 were that the fans should be capable of being reversed in an emergency to drive oxygen to different districts. Electrical equipment should be regularly maintained, and the abundant dust should be constantly dampened on roadways, on tunnel sides, on the rails, and on the drams. From this first disaster came that phrase that is all too common, the one I mentioned earlier: lessons will be learned. How often do we hear it in the aftermath of failing, calamity, despair, and chronic mistakes are followed by the glib phrase, the one just said, lessons will be learned. Are they ever? It is too easy a response, and in so many cases, ineffective and totally meaningless. After the first Senghenydd disaster of 1901, recommendations were to be implemented, as mentioned, at the latest by January the 1st, 1913. The company asked for an extension, and got it, until September the 16th of that year. The date came and went, and at 8:10 a.m. on October the 13th, there was an almighty explosion, with a screaming sound of shattering wood and clashing metal. The cage shot up the shaft at such a rate that it decapitated a banksman standing at the edge. The colliery hooter let out its mournful cry. Edward Shaw, the manager, bravely went down the unaffected shaft, but in so doing wasted time, and the mine's rescue crews from Porth and the Rhondda were not called for 2.5 hours. When the water pipes were used, they were found to be woefully small and ineffective. 18 survivors were found in the Botanic District on October the 15th, and this gave rise to false hopes. No one else was found alive, however, in the affected districts. Some of those who were brought up could not be identified. Others were identified by their pitiful possessions. Some were not brought up at all. In all, 439 men and boys were killed, plus a rescuer. Some had died in family groups, because that was the way of working. Fathers training their sons, looking after them, and ensuring that the wage packet in production stayed in the family as far as possible. Unlike the 1901 explosion, where reports spoke of women weeping, wailing, and tearing their hair out in anguish, there was an eerie silence in 1913, almost a dignified solemnity, and a numbing disbelief at the tragedy itself, and the creeping realization of the after effects on the community and the families. My association with Senghenydd goes back to a brief flirtation with a rugby club many years ago, when I played a couple of games for their team. And some years later, when I served here as a primary school teacher under Di Parry, the local headmaster. My association with coal, however, goes deeper. I am a man of the Ammon Valley, and I well remember my grandfather being killed in the Steer Pit, Gwaenca Gyrwen. I was 7 when they brought his body home, and I remember clearly the family trauma. Senghenydd was different, though. There was a family trauma, several times over in every other household. The scale of the loss was difficult to comprehend. The figures speak for themselves. 205 widows, 542 fatherless children, 62 aged dependents, 800 affected in all. Commercial Street, the street behind you, leading out of the village, lost 45 men. High Street, up on the ridge where people now stand today, lost 35. Stanley Street, 19. The 4 terraces of Woodland, Kenneth, Graig and Phillips, you can just see their rooftops behind me, beyond the trees. They lost 56. Mrs. Elizabeth Twining of Commercial Street, who became a widow a year before the disaster, lost 3 sons in it. Benjamin Priest of Eland Road died with his 2 sons, Tommy, aged 16, and Jimmy, just 14. The story continued in so many houses. The funerals, when they came, were dramatic and harrowing in their sheer numbers, as they travelled slowly to the graveyards of Eglwys-Ullain and Penrhyn. The funerals, when they came, were dramatic and harrowing in their sheer numbers, as they travelled slowly to the graveyards of Eglwys-Ullain and Penrhyn. On many of the gravestones in Welsh was inscribed, Bifarw yn Nanchwa Senghenydd. He died in the Senghenydd explosion. Following an official inquiry, the company and owner, Sir William Thomas Lewis, who had become Lord Merthyr of Senghenydd, was fined £10. The manager, Edward Shaw, was fined £24. Levels of official compensation dragged their feet, and newspapers reported the life of a miner had worked out at being worth just over a shilling each. It was, of course, in that kind of era. A man who started an 8-hour shift and was killed 3 hours into it was not paid for the 5 hours he failed to work. Concessionary coal, part of the miner's agreement, stopped on his death, the widow getting just 1 sympathy load. In many cases, horses were worth more than men. Horses, you see, had to be bought. Miners were in plentiful supply. The Universal Pit stayed open until 1928. The buildings were cleared in 1963, and the shafts were finally capped in 1979. In 1913, some 100,000 visitors came to Senghenydd, not with a callous, morbid motive, but in sympathy, concerned curiosity, and disbelief that such a thing could have happened. We are obviously fewer people today, but looking around at you all, in your vast hundreds nevertheless, on the road, on the site, and on the slope that leads up to High Street on the ridge, there is a warmth and comradeship in the gathering. Be sure that in media, in mind, and in memory, Senghenydd is in focus today, worldwide. The story will resonate in so many similar communities, communities who know, or have known. The virtues and vices embedded in the narrative are timeless, and to use the pit's name, also universal. It's a question of hindsight, insight, and foresight, isn't it? How can you really have the foresight to go forward without the insight of knowing who you are, and the hindsight to know what made you, where you're from, and what molded you as a person today? Today we are all sons and daughters of the strata that was coal, and all that it meant in our lives and the lives of the special mining communities. Diolch o galon am ddod yma heddiw. Mae'n dda I gael chi yma. Heartfelt thanks for coming here today. It's good to have you here. As we unveil the National Mining Memorial, da chi cofiwch pob trychineb a damwain yng Nghymru. Da chi cofiwch Senghenydd. Remember all the disasters and deaths in Wales, and as a symbol, remember Senghenydd. Remember Senghenydd.